In the heart of Austin, Texas, there was a small, unassuming restaurant that had earned a cult following among locals. The Butcher's Delight was famous for its unique and exotic menu, where the specialty was an ever-changing mystery burger. People would line up for hours just to get a taste of whatever concoction Chef Thomas Rowe had whipped up that day. No one knew exactly what went into his burgers, and that was part of the allure. Rowe's skill with meat was unparalleled, and the whispers about the secret ingredient were only part of what made his restaurant infamous. But behind the aroma of sizzling patties and the charming smile Rowe wore for his customers, something darker simmered. Rowe, a former Army chef, was a man with a sinister secret. No one could know the truth about what he was really cooking or the deadly game he was playing with his unsuspecting patrons. At home, Rowe's life wasn't as perfect as it appeared. He had a wife, Clara, who was smart, ambitious, and well aware of her husband's growing obsession with his craft. Clara had always supported Rowe's dreams of becoming a celebrated chef, but lately she had grown suspicious of the restaurant's unusual menu and the strange things she'd found in the freezer. Clara had been married to Thomas for over 15 years, and their relationship had always been a complex one. Rowe was charming, but distant. Their marriage was built on unspoken agreements, and Clara had long since stopped asking questions about the late nights at the restaurant, the secrecy surrounding his ingredients, and the strange deliveries that came in the dead of night. But that all changed one fateful evening. Clara had been in the kitchen, organizing the pantry, when she came across something that made her blood run cold. It was a strange, small freezer tucked away in the back, one she had never noticed before. Her curiosity piqued. She opened it, only to find bundles of wrapped meat that didn't look quite right. It wasn't beef, or pork, or anything she recognized. Something about the packages felt off. And then she found a label on one of the bundles. Human. The blood drained from Clara's face as she stared at the label, her mind racing. She thought it was a sick joke at first, but the more she looked at the meat, the more certain she became. Her husband had been hiding something, a dark, horrific secret. That night, Clara confronted Thomas. He came home late, as usual, and found her standing in the kitchen, her face pale and full of terror. "What is this?" she demanded, holding up the package with the label. "What are you really doing at that restaurant?" Rowe froze, his hand still gripping the doorframe. For the first time in years, Clara saw fear in his eyes. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, but in that moment his facade cracked. "It's not what you think," Rowe said, his voice shaking. I, I can't explain." Clara didn't want to hear the explanation. Her mind was racing too fast. She thought back to the customers who raved about his burgers, how they always seemed to ask for more, how they'd leave his restaurant with smiles, unaware of the horror they had just consumed. "You've been feeding people human meat, haven't you?" Clara's voice trembled with anger and disgust. "You're a killer, Thomas." Rowe's face twisted into a mask of rage. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped. "You don't understand what I've had to do to get where I am. People love the food, Clara. They ask for more. They beg for it. I'm giving them what they want." Clara stepped back, horrified by his words. She could barely breathe. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, was nothing like she thought he was. He was a monster. "I'm going to the police," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I'm going to expose you for what you really are." Rowe's eyes widened, and for a moment, Clara thought she saw a flicker of desperation in his gaze. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker, something dangerous. "You can't do that, Clara," Rowe said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know what you're dealing with. If you expose me, I'll lose everything. I won't let that happen." Clara stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're sick, Thomas. You need help. But if you won't get it, I will make sure the world knows what you've done." Rowe's gaze turned icy. He took a step forward, and Clara instinctively took a step back. The fear in her chest was growing, but she couldn't show it. "You really think you can just walk away from this?" Rowe's voice was almost a whisper now, but it held an undeniable edge. "If you do, you're going to regret it." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant by that, but she knew deep down that she was in grave danger. Go ahead, Rose said almost too calmly. Go to the police. But remember, you can't undo what you've seen. And once you know the truth, you can't ever unknow it. Clara didn't respond. Instead, she turned and stormed out of the kitchen, her mind racing. She knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let Roe get away with this. She couldn't let him continue to harm innocent people. But as she reached for her phone to call the authorities, the door behind her slammed shut, and Roe's voice echoed in her ears. Clara, he called out softly, you should have stayed quiet. The next morning, Clara was never seen again. Her disappearance was as sudden as it was terrifying. No one had heard from her since the confrontation, and Roe's calm demeanor when questioned by the police only added to the suspicion. He claimed she had simply left, that she had been angry about something trivial and decided to walk out. But the detectives weren't convinced. Detective Maria Hernandez had been assigned to the case. She was no stranger to the darkness lurking beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives, and she immediately sensed that something was off about Thomas Roe. His answers didn't add up, and Clara's sudden vanishing wasn't something she could ignore. As she dug deeper into Roe's background, she uncovered troubling details. His restaurant, once a local favorite, had received a series of complaints about unusual meats being served. Some customers had even reported feeling ill after eating there. But the complaints were always dismissed. It seemed that Roe had managed to charm his way out of any serious investigation. But now with Clara gone, and no explanation as to where she was, Hernandez couldn't shake the feeling that Roe knew more than he was letting on. She would soon uncover the truth, and Roe would learn that no matter how much he tried to cover his tracks, justice was coming for him. Detective Maria Hernandez leaned back in her chair, the hum of the police station echoing around her as she stared at the case files in front of her. Clara Roe had been missing for 48 hours, and there was no sign of her anywhere. The absence of any leads was frustrating, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. The disappearance of a wife was not unusual in her line of work, but everything about Thomas Roe didn't sit right with her. His calmness when questioned, the way he dismissed his wife's sudden disappearance as nothing more than a petty argument, it didn't add up. People didn't just vanish without a trace, and Maria was determined to find out why Clara had disappeared and whether Thomas Roe was involved. She spent the rest of the day reviewing the evidence. Clara's phone records showed she hadn't made any calls after the confrontation with Thomas. Her bank accounts hadn't been touched either. It was as if she had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. There was no history of violent behavior between the couple, at least not reported. But something about the way Thomas had reacted to her disappearance nagged at Maria. The next step was to visit the Butcher's Delight, Roe's restaurant. The place had always had a reputation for serving high-quality meats, but Maria's instincts told her there was more to it than just a successful chef. She needed answers. The Butcher's Delight was a small but trendy spot on the outskirts of downtown Austin. The smell of sizzling meat wafted through the door as Maria stepped inside. The dimly lit interior was cozy, with polished wood floors and an industrial vibe. The waitstaff gave her wary glances as she flashed her badge and approached the kitchen. Thomas Roe was at the stove, his white chef's coat perfectly pressed as he flipped a sizzling burger on the grill. The sight of him in his element made Maria's stomach twist. He looked like any other chef, focused, efficient, and in control. But Maria knew better than to let appearances fool her. This man had secrets, and it was her job to uncover them. Detective Hernandez, Roe said, looking up from the grill with a practiced smile. What can I do for you? Chef Roe, Maria replied, her voice firm. I'm here about your wife. Clara Roe has been missing for 2 days. We need to know if you've heard from her. Roe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered. I've already told the police everything I know. Clara left. She got upset after our argument, and she hasn't been back since. Maria nodded, her eyes scanning the kitchen. The low hum of the kitchen equipment and the hiss of meat cooking filled the silence. Is that all? No other explanation? No sign of where she went? Roe set the spatula down and wiped his hands on a cloth, his movements almost robotic. Look, detective, I don't know what else to tell you. If she didn't want to be found, she wouldn't be. It's just the way things are sometimes. Maria said, her gaze narrowing as she took a step closer to the stainless steel counter where a tray of neatly wrapped meat was laid out. I've been reviewing your restaurant's history, Chef Rowe. Some of your customers have had interesting things to say about your burgers. Rowe's eyes darkened, and for a moment, his face seemed to harden into something unrecognizable. I don't know what you're implying, but if you're suggesting something untoward, I won't have it. My restaurant is well respected in this town. Maria raised an eyebrow. I didn't say anything about untoward, but you do serve mystery burgers, don't you? Do you ever reveal what goes into them? Rowe's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, Maria thought he might snap. But instead he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. The mystery is part of the experience. People come here for the thrill, the unexpected. We don't reveal the ingredients, but we serve only the highest quality cuts. That's what makes us special. Maria didn't respond right away. She wasn't convinced. There was something about the way Rowe deflected her questions, how his attention kept flickering nervously toward the back of the kitchen, that made her suspicious. She needed to look deeper. Can I take a look around the kitchen? She asked, her voice casual but firm. Rowe hesitated, his eyes flicking to the back of the kitchen where the freezer was. Maria noticed it immediately. It was out of place, tucked behind a set of shelves, a small locked door with a padlock. It was strange that a kitchen freezer would need to be locked, especially in a place with so much foot traffic. No need to look around, Rowe said quickly. Everything's under control. I promise you, Detective, Clara's disappearance is nothing more than a family spat. Maria's instincts screamed at her to push harder, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. If you're sure, she said, her tone neutral, I'll leave you to your work, but I'll be back if I find anything else. And trust me, Chef Rowe, I'll find it. As she turned to leave, she saw a flash of something in Rowe's eyes. Fear. Just a brief moment, but it was there. He wasn't as confident as he wanted her to believe. The next day, Maria took her suspicions to the forensics team. They ran a search of Clara's phone, and after some digging, they discovered several messages between her and a friend she had confided in. In one of the texts, Clara had mentioned being concerned about what her husband had been doing at the restaurant. She had sent the message just hours before she disappeared. I'm going to the police tomorrow, Clara had written. I've seen things I can't ignore anymore. I have to do the right thing. Maria's heart sank. It was clear now. Clara had known something was terribly wrong, and she had been planning to go public with it. Rowe had learned about Clara's plans, and Maria feared that was the last straw. The case was far from over. Maria had learned enough to know that Rowe's story didn't hold water. There was more to Clara's disappearance than a simple argument. And if her suspicions were correct, Thomas Rowe was hiding more than just his culinary secrets. Maria would need to return to the Butcher's Delight. She needed to find a way to get inside that locked freezer. If she could uncover what Rowe was hiding, it would be the key to unraveling the truth. And if Clara was still alive, it would be the clue that could bring her home. But time was running out. Rowe was getting more desperate, and the more Maria uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Detective Maria Hernandez sat at her desk, staring at the message on Clara Rowe's phone screen. I'm going to the police tomorrow. I've seen things I can't ignore anymore. I have to do the right thing. But Clara never made it to the police station. Maria's gut told her that whatever Clara had discovered about her husband's restaurant was the key to the case. And that locked freezer at the Butcher's Delight? That was the first place she needed to check. She picked up her phone and called her partner, Detective James Carter. James, I need a search warrant for Thomas Rowe's restaurant. Something's off and I need to get inside that kitchen. You got probable cause? James asked. Maria exhaled sharply. Clara was about to report something illegal at that restaurant before she disappeared. Rowe's story doesn't add up, and I don't like the way he reacted when I asked about the kitchen. James sighed. I'll see what I can do, but don't get ahead of yourself. We need solid evidence. Evidence! That was the problem. Clara was missing, but there was no proof of foul play. Yet, Maria needed to move fast before Rowe could cover his tracks. Maria didn't wait for the warrant. She wasn't going to sit around while Rowe destroyed evidence. That night, she drove to the Butcher's Delight alone. The restaurant was dark, closed for the night, but Maria knew chefs often prepped food after hours. If Rowe was inside, she had to be careful. She parked a block away and approached the building on foot, staying in the shadows. As she neared the back entrance, she saw a faint light glowing from inside. Someone was there. Maria reached for the handle. Locked. But she had picked enough locks in her career to know this one wasn't a challenge. A few quick movements with her lockpick set, and the door clicked open. The kitchen smelled of raw meat and cleaning chemicals. The hum of the refrigerators filled the silence. Maria moved quietly, her eyes scanning the stainless steel counters, the meat slicers, the trays of prepped food. Then she saw it, the locked freezer. She stepped closer and examined the heavy-duty padlock securing it. It was new, the metal barely scratched. Someone really didn't want anyone going inside. She turned, searching the kitchen for anything useful. And then she spotted them, keys hanging on a hook near the oven. Maria grabbed them and tested each one on the padlock. The third key clicked and the lock popped open. She hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed that whatever was behind this door was something she wasn't prepared to see. But she had no choice. Maria pulled the freezer door open. The first thing that hit her was the smell. Strong, metallic, and wrong. It was colder than she expected, and frost clung to the metal walls. Large slabs of wrapped meat were stacked on steel shelves. Her eyes swept over the packages. Something wasn't right. The cuts were too irregular. Not like standard butchered meat. She stepped closer and unwrapped one of the packages. And then her stomach turned. A human hand. Fingers curled slightly, frozen solid, the skin pale and bluish from the cold. Maria stumbled back, bile rising in her throat. She pulled out her phone and snapped pictures before moving to another package. This one held what looked like a thigh, the skin still attached. She forced herself to keep going, checking more packages until she found it. Clara's face, or what was left of it. Her head had been severed, her once beautiful features frozen in a look of horror. Maria staggered backward, slamming a hand over her mouth. Thomas Rowe hadn't just killed his wife, he had butchered her, and worse, he had served her to his customers. Maria bolted from the freezer, slamming the door shut behind her. She fumbled for her phone and dialed James. "James, get to the Butcher's Delight now. I found her. I found Clara." "Wait, what? What do you mean?" "Rowe killed her. He butchered her. And James, he's been cooking her." A stunned silence on the other end. Then James cursed. "We're on our way. Get out of there now." But before Maria could move, she heard the sound of a knife scraping against metal. She turned slowly. Thomas Rowe stood in the doorway, a large butcher knife in his hand. His chef's coat was stained with grease and blood. His eyes, usually so controlled and charming, were wild now. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, detective?" he said softly. Maria's hand tightened around her gun. "Drop the knife, Rowe. It's over." But Rowe only smiled. "You think this is the first time someone has poked around my kitchen?" Maria's pulse pounded. She had to keep him talking until backup arrived. "You killed your wife," she said, "and you fed her to your customers." Rowe sighed, shaking his head. "It wasn't personal. She left me no choice. She wanted to ruin everything I built. Do you have any idea how hard I worked for this? The thrill, the power. People ate what I gave them and loved it. And Clara wanted to take that away." "You're sick," Rowe smirked. "And yet people have been coming back for my burgers for years." Maria's grip on her gun tightened. "Drop the knife or I'll shoot." Rowe took a slow step forward. "You won't shoot me, detective. You need me alive. You need answers." Maria's heart pounded. She needed to stall just a little longer. Then the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the restaurant windows. Rowe's smirk disappeared. "You called them," he muttered, his eyes darkening. Maria didn't hesitate. She raised her gun and fired a warning shot into the floor. For the first time, fear flickered in Rowe's eyes. He dropped the knife, raising his hands as officers burst through the door. James rushed inside, gun drawn. "Maria, you okay?" Maria exhaled shakily. "I found Clara." James looked past her, to the still open freezer door. His face went pale. "Jesus Christ." Rowe chuckled, even as officers cuffed him. "It's funny, you know. The only thing people ever cared about was how good the food tasted. Not once did they question it." Maria turned away, her stomach still twisting. The case was solved, but she knew the nightmares were only beginning. Thomas Rowe sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his wrists cuffed to the metal table. His chef's coat had been taken from him, replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Despite everything, he still carried an eerie calm, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Detective Maria Hernandez watched him through the two-way mirror. Her stomach was still churning from what she had found in that freezer. The smell, the sight of Clara's severed head, the realization that dozens, maybe hundreds of people had unknowingly eaten human flesh. James Carter stood beside her, arms crossed. "You ready for this?" Maria nodded. "Let's break him." Maria stepped into the room, setting a thick file down on the table. She sat across from Rowe, staring at him for a long moment. He grinned. "Detective, hope you enjoyed your meal last time you dined at my restaurant." Maria ignored him, flipping open the file. Graphic crime scene photos stared back at Rowe. The freezer, the dismembered body parts, the bloody butcher knives. His grin faltered, just slightly. "You're looking at multiple charges of murder, desecration of a corpse, and God knows how many counts of serving human flesh to the public," Maria said, her voice steady. "You should start talking." Rowe leaned back. "Talking about what?" Maria slammed a photo in front of him, Clara's frozen, lifeless face. "This," she snapped. "Your wife, the woman who loved you. Tell me how you could do this to her." Rowe sighed and shook his head. "You don't understand, Detective. Clara wasn't innocent. She was a problem. She threatened to destroy everything I worked for." Maria's fingers curled into fists. "So you butchered her?" Rowe chuckled. "You think she was my first?" Maria felt a chill run through her. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach drop. "How long have you been doing this?" Rowe shrugged. "Let's just say Clara was the first one to figure it out. She was never supposed to." Maria leaned forward. "Who else?" Rowe's smirk returned. "Now that's a secret recipe, Detective." Maria left the interrogation room and took a deep breath. She had dealt with murderers before, but Rowe was different. He enjoyed this. James was already pulling records. "We need to go through every missing person case in this city from the last 5 years." Maria nodded. "Start with restaurant employees. Anyone who worked for him and suddenly quit." The team worked through the night, piecing together a horrifying pattern. Over the past 5 years, at least 6 employees had vanished. None of them had families looking for them. All had been reported as runaways or quit without notice. Rowe had been hunting the forgotten. A call came in from the forensics team. "Detective, we found traces of human DNA in the restaurant's meat grinder. Several different profiles. Some don't match Clara." Maria's stomach clenched. Rowe had been grinding human flesh into burger meat for years, and no one had noticed. Armed with the new evidence, Maria returned to the interrogation room. She dropped the forensic report in front of Rowe. "We have DNA from 6 different people in your meat grinder. You're done." Rowe's smirk didn't waver. "You know, Detective, I always found it funny. People say they care about what they eat. Organic, grass-fed, free-range. But when it tastes good, they don't ask questions." Maria slammed a hand on the table. "Who were they?" Rowe sighed. "Drifters, homeless, a few former employees. No one important." Maria's blood boiled. "They were human beings." Rowe shrugged. "They were meat." Maria had heard enough. She stood, motioning to James. "Get him out of my sight." As officers led Rowe away, he turned back one last time. "You'll miss my cooking." Maria clenched her jaw. Rot in prison. She watched as they took him away. The case was closed, but the horror of it would haunt her forever. The small town of Glenwood, Texas, would never be the same again. When the news broke, people were stunned. No one suspected that the man they had trusted to serve them the finest steaks and burgers had been selling human flesh for years. Thomas Rowe, once a respected chef, was now the face of the most horrific culinary scandal in Texas history. Detective Maria Hernandez sat at her desk sifting through files. The case was far from over. Rowe had confessed to murdering his wife, Clara, and feeding her to his customers. But Maria knew that there were more victims. The missing people, the drifters, the runaways, the lonely forgotten individuals who had disappeared without a trace. James Carter entered the room with a folder in his hand. "We've got more information, Maria." She looked up. "What did you find?" James flipped the folder open and placed it on her desk. It was a list of names, people who had vanished over the last 5 years. Some were local, others from neighboring towns. But the pattern was undeniable. All had crossed paths with the butcher's delight. Maria's heart sank. "How many?" James looked grim. 15, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. We still haven't gone through all of Roe's employees or the people who had interactions with him through his catering business. Maria rubbed her temples. This wasn't just about Clara anymore. It was about dozens, maybe hundreds of lives lost to Roe's twisted obsession. She reached for her phone and dialed the local news station. "We need to make a public appeal. The more people we talk to, the more likely we are to uncover what really happened." Maria and James visited the Butcher's Delight again, this time with a full forensic team. Roe had already confessed, but they needed more evidence. They needed to know just how deep this went. The restaurant was eerily quiet. Roe had been arrested, and the place was now under lock and key. The smell of raw meat lingered in the air. But there was something off about the space. It felt like a tomb. The forensic team went through every inch of the kitchen, checking the meat grinders, the refrigerators, and the deep freezers. They found more remains, small fragments of bone and tissue in the grinders. But what shocked them the most was the discovery of a hidden compartment underneath the kitchen floor. It wasn't large, but it was enough to hide something, or someone. Inside, the team found more body parts, wrapped in plastic and stacked neatly. These weren't from Clara. These were from the missing people, the ones Roe had lured in with promises of work or a hot meal. Maria stood in the doorway, watching as the team worked. It was hard to believe that all of this had been happening under the nose of an entire town. How had no one suspected anything? How had no one questioned the odd taste of Roe's burgers? James approached her, his face pale. "We've identified the remains. Most of them match people who have been missing for years." Maria nodded slowly, her mind racing. She was no longer just solving a murder case. She was uncovering a nightmare, a twisted series of killings that spanned years. The town of Glenwood had been rocked to its core. People who had enjoyed Roe's food for years were now left in disbelief. Some were angry, others in denial, but all were terrified. How many of them had unknowingly eaten human flesh? How many had visited the restaurant and ordered one of Roe's famous burgers? Maria was bombarded with calls from local news stations, concerned citizens, and even families who feared that their missing loved ones might be among the victims. The pressure was overwhelming. At a press conference, Maria stood before the cameras, her face composed but her heart heavy. "We are still in the process of identifying all the victims of Thomas Roe. If you have any information regarding missing persons, we urge you to come forward. We believe Roe's killing spree may have gone on for years, and we need to find the truth." She could see the fear in the eyes of the reporters, the residents, even the other law enforcement officers. They wanted answers. They wanted closure. But Maria knew that what she had uncovered was just the beginning. The next day, Maria received an unexpected call. It was from Clara's parents. They had been contacted by Roe's attorney, who claimed that Clara had written a letter before her death. The letter was supposed to be a confession of some sort. Maria was skeptical. Roe had tried to paint Clara as the problem, his victim, his excuse for the crimes he committed. But Clara had been smart. She had been on the verge of exposing him. Clara's parents handed the letter over to Maria. It was addressed to her, written in a shaky hand. "Maria, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how deep it went. At first I thought it was just the drugs, the late nights, his mood swings. But then I saw it. Bodies in the freezer, people who had gone missing, their names lost in the news. I wanted to leave him, but I was scared. I couldn't do it alone. I hope you can stop him. I hope you can make him pay for what he's done. Please, Maria, don't let him get away with this." The letter was short, but it confirmed everything Maria had feared. Clara had known about the bodies. She had seen the horrors, and she had been trying to get out before Roe could silence her. With the letter in hand, Maria knew she had enough to charge Roe with multiple counts of murder, desecration of a corpse, and the sale of human flesh. But there were still many questions left unanswered. How many victims had there been? How many more bodies were hidden in Roe's restaurant or his home? And how had Roe managed to keep his crimes secret for so long? Maria wasn't going to stop until she had all the answers. She was going to make sure that Thomas Roe would never hurt anyone again. And that meant taking down the dark empire he had built, one piece at a time. But there was something else. The town of Glenwood was never going to forget the truth about the butcher's delight. The fear, the horror, the uncertainty. It would haunt them for years to come. For Maria, the case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about making sure that the victims, both seen and unseen, got the justice they deserved. Glenwood was a town where everyone knew everyone else. The kind of place where neighbors shared meals, kids played together, and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. But now everything had changed. What had once been a peaceful, idyllic community had been shattered. Thomas Roe's horrifying crimes were out in the open, and the town was still grappling with the extent of the damage he had caused. Detective Maria Hernandez stood at the edge of the Butcher's Delight restaurant, staring at the neon sign that flickered dimly in the evening light. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had first walked into the place, thinking it was just another successful small-town business. Now it was a crime scene, a chilling reminder of the monster who had been feeding the town his grotesque creations. Maria exhaled slowly, steeling herself. They had made progress, but the full extent of Roe's crimes was still coming to light, and they were far from finished. The forensic team had worked tirelessly since the discovery of the hidden compartment beneath the restaurant. They had identified 5 more victims, all of whom had vanished in the last 3 years. Their bodies had been carefully butchered and stored, likely ready to be ground into the next batch of Roe's infamous burgers. But what bothered Maria the most was the evidence they had uncovered regarding Roe's catering business. It wasn't just the regular customers who had been fed human flesh. Roe had expanded his operation. He had been catering events, weddings, corporate dinners, serving human meat to unsuspecting clients. The idea was enough to make Maria's stomach turn. She had already spoken with some of these clients, and it seemed that no one had suspected anything. There were no complaints. The food had been perfect, and the prices had been fair. How could people have missed the signs? As disturbing as it was, the catering side of the business had turned out to be Roe's bread and butter. It wasn't just a few people in a small town. Roe had been feeding human flesh to a wide circle of affluent clients who would never have imagined that their exquisite meals were made from body parts. Maria called in James Carter and the rest of the team to discuss their next move. She wasn't about to let Roe's twisted empire go unpunished. Maria's phone buzzed. A text message from one of her officers. "Detective, we've got a breakthrough. A woman came forward, says she worked for Roe for 6 months." Maria's heart skipped. It was the first time someone had come forward from Roe's inner circle. If they could find out more from her, they could finally build a stronger case. Within hours, they were sitting across from Rebecca Davis, a former waitress at the Butcher's Delight. Her hands shook as she recounted her time working for Roe. "I didn't know what was going on at first," she said, voice trembling. "He was a great boss. Treated us well, paid us on time. But then, there were strange things. Like sometimes when he'd come back from the freezer, he'd be covered in blood." Maria leaned forward. "What kind of blood?" Rebecca looked down. "I never asked. But it wasn't just animal blood. It was thicker, like human blood." James scribbled notes furiously. "And did you ever see what was in the freezer?" Rebecca hesitated. "Once, there were bags of meat. It didn't look right, but Roe told me not to ask questions. He said it was for special orders, expensive cuts. He said it was a family recipe." Maria could feel the weight of her words, the missing people, the hidden bodies, the sickening truth. Roe had made it seem like a normal kitchen, a normal business. But behind the scenes, he had been turning humans into food. "I didn't stay long after that," Rebecca continued, "but I heard things. He said no one would ever believe the truth. He said he had it all covered." Maria asked her to stay in touch and left the interview feeling a mix of relief and horror. At least now they had a witness who could testify to Roe's behavior. Back at the station, Maria and James reviewed the evidence. They'd had a few leads, but there was one that stood out. Roe had been selling his human meat to underground markets. It wasn't just local customers. He had been shipping portions of his special meat to high-end restaurants across the country. This was bigger than Glenwood. Rowe had networked with dark web chefs, high-end food enthusiasts, and even black market dealers. He had created a niche that was both terrifying and profitable. Maria had a sudden thought. Why had Rowe done this? What had driven him to such extreme lengths? "I'm going to take a look into his past," Maria said to James. "We need to understand what made him this way. There's always a trigger." Maria and James spent hours combing through Rowe's past. They tracked down old acquaintances, former employers, and even his family. Rowe's story was hardly a fairy tale. He had grown up in a troubled household, raised by a father who was both an alcoholic and a controlling figure. His mother had left when he was young, and Rowe had been raised in a string of foster homes. But it wasn't just his upbringing. Rowe had a history of obsessive behaviors. He had always been fascinated by food, but it was more than a passion. It was a compulsion, a need to control, to possess, to feed. As a teenager, he had worked at a butcher shop where he learned the craft of cutting and preparing meat. His boss, an older man who had become something of a mentor to him, had been involved in shady dealings, some of which involved selling illegal meat. Rowe had been exposed to this world at an early age. By the time he opened the Butcher's Delight, Rowe had developed a dark fixation with the human body. He had convinced himself that the ultimate form of control was to consume what he killed, to make his victims into something he could hold on to forever. And it had all started with a tragedy, the death of a woman who had once been his lover. She had tried to expose him, and in a moment of rage, he had killed her. He hadn't planned on it, but once he had tasted the flesh, he had become addicted to it. Maria sat back, her mind spinning. It wasn't just murder. It was about possession, control, and an insatiable hunger that had gone far beyond normal human limits. As Maria prepared for the final confrontation with Thomas Rowe, she knew this case was far from ordinary. She was dealing with a man who had turned murder into a twisted art, who had turned human life into a commodity. But there was one thing she knew for certain: justice was coming, and Rowe, no matter how many lives he had taken, would never taste freedom again. The air in the Texas courthouse felt heavier than usual. As the trial of Thomas Rowe began, it was clear that this case would be like no other. The small town of Glenwood had been transformed. The once idyllic streets were now filled with reporters, spectators, and people hoping to witness the fall of a man they had once trusted. Detective Maria Hernandez stood in the back of the courtroom, her eyes trained on Thomas Rowe as he sat calmly at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him. Rowe had been charged with multiple counts of murder, human trafficking, desecration of corpses, and cannibalism. His expression remained detached, as if he were simply awaiting the inevitable conclusion of his crimes. It had been months since his confession, and yet the trial felt like a long time coming. Maria had worked tirelessly with the prosecution, helping to piece together the full scope of Rowe's horrifying actions. The evidence was overwhelming, but she knew that the true test would be whether the jury could truly understand the depth of Rowe's depravity. As the trial began, the prosecution painted a chilling portrait of Rowe's crimes. They presented evidence of the bodies found in the freezer, the human remains discovered in his kitchen, and the testimonies from his former employees. Rebecca Davis, the waitress who had come forward, took the stand, recounting her experiences working at the Butcher's Delight. Her voice trembled as she described Rowe's strange behavior, his obsession with certain cuts of meat, and the unsettling secrecy that surrounded his restaurant. "We didn't ask questions," Rebecca said, her eyes fixed on Rowe. "He was our boss. He treated us well, but there was always something off about him. I never imagined it could be this sickening." Maria watched as Rowe's face remained stoic, his eyes cold and calculating. It was almost as if he were watching the trial unfold from a distance, detached from the reality of his actions. But the prosecution wasn't done. They introduced Clara Rowe's letter, the one she had written just before her death. Maria could see the impact it had on the jury. Clara's words confirmed what they had all feared. The victim had known about Rowe's grisly business and had tried to escape. The prosecution also presented the testimonies of the families of missing persons. the people whose loved ones had vanished without a trace. Rowe's actions weren't just about Clara. He had destroyed lives across the region, and the full extent of his crimes was starting to sink in. Rowe's defense attorney tried to paint him as a man driven to madness, a man who had been the victim of an abusive upbringing. They claimed that Rowe's obsession with food had spiraled out of control due to trauma from his childhood. They argued that the murders were acts of desperation, that Rowe had been under extreme psychological pressure. But no one in the courtroom was buying it. The jury had already seen too much. They had heard the testimonies, seen the evidence, and they knew the truth. Rowe wasn't a man pushed to the edge by his past. He was a cold-blooded killer who had used his culinary skills to mask his atrocities. Rowe's defense lawyer was grasping at straws, trying to find some way to explain away the horror Rowe had created. But as each witness took the stand and each piece of evidence was presented, Rowe's defense crumbled. Finally, it was time for Detective Maria Hernandez to take the stand. She had worked tirelessly on the case, and now it was her turn to share everything she had uncovered. Maria stood up from the table, straightening her suit as she walked to the witness stand. She could feel the weight of the room on her shoulders, the eyes of the jury, the spectators, and even Rowe himself watching her closely. As she sat down and began to testify, her voice was calm but firm. I was the lead investigator in the case of Thomas Rowe, and over the course of my investigation, I uncovered a disturbing pattern. Rowe used his position as a chef and a business owner to lure people in, to gain their trust, and ultimately to kill them. His victims were people who were forgotten by society, those who would go unnoticed when they vanished. Maria recounted the key moments of the investigation, finding the hidden compartment in the restaurant, discovering the human remains, and identifying the victims. She also shared the details of Clara Rowe's letter, her final plea for help before she was silenced by her husband. As we went through the evidence, we began to piece together Rowe's twisted operation. This wasn't just about one woman. This was about a man who had been murdering and feeding his victims to unsuspecting people for years. He had built an empire of death disguised as a successful restaurant. Maria paused for a moment, locking eyes with Rowe. She could feel the tension in the room, the palpable sense of dread. Thomas Rowe didn't just kill people, he used them. He saw them as nothing more than ingredients for his sick culinary creations. And in doing so, he became a monster. The courtroom was silent as the closing arguments began. The prosecution made their case. Rowe was a cold, calculated killer who had destroyed lives for his own twisted pleasure. The defense tried to argue that Rowe was a victim of his past, a man driven to madness by childhood trauma. But there was no denying the facts. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Rowe, guilty of all charges, including multiple counts of murder, desecration of corpses, and human trafficking. Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't the kind of relief that came from personal victory, but rather from the knowledge that justice had finally been served for the victims, the families, and the town of Glenwood. Rowe's reign of terror had come to an end. As Rowe was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Maria watched him closely. There was no sign of remorse on his face. He had been defeated, but it was clear that his mind was still somewhere far beyond the reach of normal human understanding. But for Maria, the case wasn't over. She knew there were still more victims out there, and she wouldn't stop until every single person who had been affected by Rowe's crimes had been accounted for. In the weeks following the trial, Maria continued to work with the families of the missing, helping them find closure. The town of Glenwood was forever changed, but the shadow of Rowe's actions would eventually begin to fade. As for Rowe, he would spend the rest of his life in prison, where he would no longer be able to cook or feed anyone again. But Maria knew the scars of this case would linger far beyond the walls of the courthouse.